So the second lesson that I'm doing for today is more of a deep dive into the more challenging aspect of the book of Joshua. There is a lot of violence in the book of Joshua. It's a book about military conquest, which is itself daunting. Add to that it's military conquest that is done in obedience to the instructions of God. At least that's the way the text records it. So it's very challenging then to ask the question at the end of Joshua, what did we learn about God from this story? It's easy if the question is, what did I learn about history? Okay, what I learned about history is this is how Israel got its land. But if the question is, what did I learn about God? In particular, is God a moral monster? And is he some kind of brutal God who sends his people out to murder other people? Is that the kind of God we serve? Is there any way to make sense of the violence in this text? That's a harder question. For me, it's one of the hardest questions. So I intentionally decided not to do this as my Sunday morning sermon because I have a rule. I don't think it's a good idea for the preacher to get up and preach his doubts about a text and say, here's all the things that I'm scared of and don't know what to do with. I mention them because I'm honest, but at the same time, you don't come to church to hear me tell you I don't understand this. So what I decided was to do a secondary sermon where I just give you the best I can do with this question that haunts me a little bit. And at the end, it's not going to settle it. I don't know anybody who's just completely settled in their mind if they're honest with these stories. Worse, it's going to come up repeatedly in the Old Testament. I'm not going to stop every time there's a violent story in the Old Testament and do this. So this lesson throughout our Gospel Project treatment of the Old Testament is just going to be my reference. If something violent happens, if Saul slays the Amalekites, or if you get around to reading Psalm 137 or any of the other really violent passages in the Bible, I'm going to refer back to this one, and it's going to kind of serve to explain my thinking on some of that as it goes on in the Old Testament. That as Christians, we find it makes us queasy, and for good reason. What's the problem? Well, the problem is, first of all, what we know about God is the general rule, the rule we thought was ironclad, is thou shalt not kill. We read that in the Ten Commandments in Exodus chapter 20 and verse 13. We can argue a little bit about the exact word. King James says, thou shalt not kill, which is a lot of people learned growing up. ESV probably more accurately says, you shall not murder. I don't think even that commandment was a universal prohibition about all kinds of killing. But at the very least, taking innocent life was prohibited. And maybe more, but at least that much. Furthermore, when you read about God, he is especially defensive towards the undefended, about those who are defenseless. So killing children is especially vile to God. Leviticus chapter 18 verse 21 says, you shall not give any of your children to offer them to Molech, and so profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. Molech is an ancient god who had a kind of a furnace in his belly, and the way the idol was constructed, and would have these outstretched arms. And then to worship him, you would literally make child sacrifice. You'd put an infant in his arms, and it would be consumed by the fires of Molech, and that's how you worship Molech. God says, I can't think of anything worse than that, right? Don't dare do that. Don't ever sacrifice children in that way. It's completely unacceptable to God. Ezekiel 20, 30, 31. Will you defile yourselves after the manner of your fathers and go whoring after the detestable things? When you present your gifts and offer up your children in fire, you defile yourselves with all your idols to this day. And shall I be inquired of by you, a house of Israel? As I live, declares the Lord God, I will not be inquired of by you. In short, if you think offering your children as a sacrifice is okay, don't ask me any questions I'm not going to answer. So if we know something about the God of the Bible, not in favor of murder, don't kill the innocent, extra protective of children. Okay, that seems pretty well true, which is what makes the story of Joshua that much more challenging. Instead of thou shalt not kill, we get thou shalt kill sometimes. In Joshua, there is just an abhorrent amount of violence, the kind that we thought we were supposed to be opposed to. Michael Pryor is an Old Testament commentator who said, "It is high time that biblical scholars, church people, and Western intellectuals read the biblical narratives we have discussed with the eyes of the Canaanites." And what he's pointing out is, if you read Joshua with the view of how did Israel get its land, then it sounds like a great story. But if you ask about all the people that got killed in the process of that, it's not nearly as appetizing. To give you an analogy, compare that to American history. Some early American textbooks would tell the story of American manifest destiny and how we tamed the West and conquered all the evil in the world, and kind of left out the part about the Trail of Tears, the horrible, wretched massacres of Native peoples in America. And it's not a simple story. Both of those stories have some truth to them. But if you are Native American, the story of the conquest of the West is a very different story. And that's what Pryor's trying to point out. Joshua sounds magnificent as long as you aren't the people in the way. For them, it's a very different story, and it's troubling. The conquest of Canaan in Joshua is filled with accounts of God commanding Israel to kill the people currently in the land. I'm just going to read one text to you because it makes for a fine example. This is from Joshua chapter 10, verses 10 through 27. I actually referenced a portion of it this morning, but left out the gory bits because I didn't want to read it. But here's verses 10. And the Lord threw them into a panic before Israel, who struck them with a great blow at Gibeon and chased them by the way of the ascent of Beth-horon, and struck them as far as Azekah and Makkedah. And as they fled before Israel, while they were going down the ascent of Beth-horon, the Lord threw down large stones from heaven on them as far as Azekah, and they died. And there were more who died because of the hailstones than the sons of Israel killed with the sword. And at that time Joshua spoke to the Lord in the day when the Lord gave the Amorites over to the sons of Israel, and he said to the side of Israel, "Sun, stand still at Gibeon, and moon in the valley of Ajalon." And the sun stood still, and the moon stopped, until the nation took vengeance on their enemies. And then you can keep on reading. It talks about the execution of the 5 Amorite kings, beginning in verse 16, and the various ways that they destroyed the cities. Verse 20, when Joshua and the sons of Israel had finished striking them with a great blow until they were wiped out, and when the remnant that remained of them had entered the fortified cities, then all the people returned safe to Joshua. In this passage, you just see just an overwhelming amount of violent content. And even the story of the sun standing still takes on a different complexion. The sun stood still so that we could continue the battle and kill some more. We're winning. It's unpleasant to tell. It's not the way you want to hear that in Bible class. In the text of Joshua, God condones killing. God supports the killing. God commands the killing. God participates in the killing, hailstones from heaven. And in instances that shock us further, God condones the killing of children, women, and babies. This comes up elsewhere in the Bible as well. Hosea 13:16. Samaria shall bear her guilt because she has rebelled against her God. They shall fall by the sword. Their little ones shall be dashed in pieces, and their pregnant women ripped open. There is no way to make that a palatable passage. This isn't a translation problem. It's a text problem. We look at it and say, how can that be okay, and what does that tell us about God? The story of Saul in the days of Samuel, 1 Samuel 15:3, he was told, "Go and strike Amalek and devote to destruction all that they have. Do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey." These are examples of absolute destruction. God himself has done something like this when they left Egypt in Exodus chapter 12, 29 through 30. At midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on his throne, and the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the livestock. And Pharaoh rose up in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in the city. For there was not a house where someone was not dead. Again, when you tell it the way we normally tell the story, this is a great triumph of God over Pharaoh. But the casualties of this conflict are enormous and staggering. And we ask again, what does this tell us about God? So I've tried to paint the picture as grimly as I can so no one can say I'm cheating. And then I want to stop for a minute and give you what I consider to be helpful insights. None of these are answers to the question. None of these actually do away with the fact that there's a lot of violence in the Old Testament. There's just not any short answers. There's not any straight roads. But there are some things that when I get utterly overwhelmed by those passages, I come back to time and again. Some of it will sound, I'll just openly admit, some of it will sound kind of cold and calculating in the face of that kind of violence. But it's the best I can do with some of these texts. First of all, if I were a defense attorney and I was trying to plead God's case, which is not a position I ever want to be in, actually. God doesn't need my defense. But if I were, we'd start with saying, are there any mitigating circumstances to these stories? Is it possible they aren't as bad as they sounded at first? There are some mitigating circumstances. In the book of Joshua, for example, there's only 3 cities that are devoted to complete annihilation. The city of Jericho in chapter 6, Ai in chapter 8, and Hazor in chapter 11. All 3 of these cities, the best we can tell from history and archaeology, is that these are fortress cities. These are military outposts, not necessarily civilian cities. Was there a civilian population there? Of course, right? It was a town, but it was a town built around a fort. And so the 3 cities that seem like they are the most violent stories in Joshua are what we would consider military targets. They're fortified cities designed to keep invasions like this one out. It's the difference between invading New York or invading the Pentagon. There is a difference. Neither of them are pleasant, but you can get the idea of the significance of the sites. So, again, if I were the defense attorney, I'd say, well, there is a difference. These aren't civilian centers as much as they are fortresses of military significance. The utter destruction plan for Jericho, Ai, and Hazor was not the norm. They were exceptional cases, which is why Joshua tells those stories. What normally happened is that as Israel came in, people ran out. Several passages mention this. God promises it in Exodus 23, 27 through 30, and Deuteronomy 9:1, that he will go as a terror to drive out the people. So again, in those cases, it's not slaughter and mayhem, it's displacement, which again is still not great. I'm trying to make it okay. But there is a difference. The wholesale destruction of a city was limited to those 3 cases of military significance. More often, people were driven out, pushed ahead. The Bible also tells us that in several of these cases, maybe all of them, peace terms were offered. There's an entire chapter of Deuteronomy chapter 20 that is devoted to the terms of peace that they were required to offer when they went into Palestine. Joshua doesn't mention it because apparently nobody took those terms. The only reference is in Joshua 11:19, which just said, none of these cities accepted peace. Well, that seems to imply they were offered it. So it's not like the Assyrians who come to town and wipe you out just for the point of doing so. There was at least an offer of negotiation at the front under the terms of Deuteronomy 20 that seems to have been rejected. Does that make everything okay? Again, no. But it is a mitigating factor in this. Another mitigating circumstance that is sometimes overplayed, the Philistines were wicked people, right? Ancient pagan life these were not upstanding citizens. These are vile and wretched cultures filled with all manner of evil. It is simply difficult for a modern person to get their head around the kind of evil horrors that lurked in the ancient pagan world and society at that time. Within certain limits, we could say none of the adults that died got any less than they deserved, because these ancient cultures, the best we can tell, were reprehensible in the way they treated each other and other people as well. Of course, the challenge to that, as you might guess, is what about the children? Here we have to make sort of a theological decision. This is a little technical, but see if you can stay with me. If you're of the slant, sometimes referred to as the Calvinistic slant, and you believe children, infants, are born with the sin of Adam, the guilt of the sin of Adam, they start out as sinners. Then these children die, and what happens? Well, presumably they're judged and condemned as sinners and face that consequence. That's a difficult one to swallow for sure. A really strict Calvinist would say, well, they deserve it, they are sinners, but even for them that's difficult. From my own theological camp, it's a little simpler because folks like me believe that children are not born unstained, but neither are they guilty. Children don't begin guilty of sin. They get there soon enough. We all come with a propensity to sin. We're all damaged by the inheritance of sin in human life. All of us are tilted towards the flesh. But I think we come with guilt when we get there. I don't think we start out. The word I would use to describe children is innocent. In that case, someone might say, well, if we slaughter these children, don't they go to heaven or something? Isn't that okay? And I think you can see pretty quickly how unsatisfying that answer is. Imagine a serial killer who gave you that answer. Oh, I killed all these children, but they're in heaven now. Right? Nobody would accept that. So the children, to me, is the biggest problem. I mean, even if I can convince myself everything else is okay and it was only military targets and the people were wicked and they deserved it, I come back to these children and I just don't know what to do about it. Hypothetically, I could ask a question. What should have been done to the children? I will say that there's nobody who's been able to give me a plan that says Israel adopts however many 100,000 Philistine children. No one can tell me what's supposed to happen. Warfare is terrible. Warfare is always terrible. And children pay the price. So I don't know what the better solution is other than not doing any of this at all, which of course would be ideal. Are there anything about God that we would know that might change, getting out of the mitigating and trying to lessen the blow a little bit? Is there anything we actually learn about God? One thing to consider is there are a lot of unknowns. This is a historical account, and no history ever gives you the whole story. There's a reason we get Joshua and Judges, right? Not one of them by themselves gives you the whole story. And even Joshua and Judges, we still don't get the whole story. Because you can't. You can't write down the whole story. It's why there's, 50 biographies of every American president, because every one of them has some detail about them that you couldn't encapsulate in a page. What information do we not have about this? Do we have enough information? Is it possible God knew things that I don't? Well, that's almost certain. What was the future of these people if they were left to their own devices? Is it possible that a more terrible future awaited these people in their sins and what they would do to their own children than anything Israel did? What are the ultimate consequences of their deaths? What took place? There are some unknowns there. And while it's not, again, comforting to me as a father of children to say, well, I just don't know enough, I do have to at least logically accept the possibility that there are things going on in the story I don't understand and be willing to at least withhold some level of judgment on that. The clearer answer that is still colder still, but will help us know something about God, is to remember that He is not only the person who saves us from sin. He's also the creator of the universe. The Old Testament in particular, but also the New. Don't let anybody convince you there's two gods, one in the Old, one in the New. Same God, both places. But the Old Testament in particular emphasizes God's right to judge people, not just the person, to hold nations and civilizations accountable all at once. As a creator, He has the right to uncreate. There's no moral imperative that said God had to create me in the first place. If there's no moral imperative for God to create me in the first place, if He wills that I should die, is there any moral imperative that says that's wrong? In Marvel fame, we get Thanos, the Mad Titan, who snaps his fingers and half the universe disappears. That's evil. But He's not the creator of the universe. If God is sustaining the universe at every second, what obligation is He to say, well, these miserable, sinful creatures, I think I'll keep them alive a little longer, as opposed to saying, no, I won't? That's a harsh reality to think about. That's not how I like to picture God. But as creator and judge and ruler of the universe, he stands in a not nice role in relation to us. I think he's good, but there is some severity to who he is that forever changes stories like this when we really sit and think about it. I had a friend who was judge in Seminole County, and he's a Christian guy. He was an elder at the church, great fella, and really not judgmental. Like if you knew him personally, he wasn't a person who would just openly criticize you for things. He was very understanding. And so this friend was in a courtroom doing his job, and he's got the robe on, the gavel, and the whole thing. And I kid you not, as the story goes, this lady stands up out of the audience and says, "You're being too judgmental." And the irony is, well, yeah, I mean, he's literally an appointed judge for our county. That's his job. In his personal life, he may not be that kind of person, but at this moment, his job is to decide right and wrong in this instance. Did you do it or did you not? God never stops being the judge. I don't know how God manages to be the compassionate, loving, sympathetic Father and forever the lawgiver and judge and creator of the universe all at the same time, but he does. And when we notice him in that role, we kind of recoil and say, whoa, that's not who I wanted to see there. But he's always been the same person. And I have to kind of wrestle with that he is within his rights to cast judgment and to execute them in ways we would find miserable and horrific, because I'm not him. That's actually the secret to this riddle. I mean, much as it is a nearly unanswerable question, the problem with the question is that I'm assuming things that would be wrong for me are wrong in the same way with God, that the same rules apply. And in some senses, my intuition says, shouldn't that be true? Shouldn't wrong just be wrong and right just be right? But when you start to think about it, that's not necessarily the case. Why is it wrong for you or me to murder? Well, because there's a law that says that. But why is there a law? Do those laws apply to everybody? They apply to everybody you know. But let me ask you a different question. How many of the 10 Commandments did God follow? In fact, if you read the 10 Commandments, almost none of them make any sense when applied to God. I shall have no other gods before myself. I shall not use my own name in vain. I shall make no graven image. That's literally the first thing he does in Genesis, is take clay and make an image of himself. Honor his father and mother. Doesn't work. Keep the Sabbath. He already did. So don't kill. Don't covet. How could God covet? He owns it all anyway. Don't bear false witness. God doesn't lie, apparently. So you can get my point that the 10 Commandments are a set of rules to explain morality to us, but there's no guarantee it really makes sense when applied to God, because he's not in the same relationship to the universe that we are. We're agents in the universe. He's the sustainer of the universe. And so it is different. In fact, the Bible explicitly says the reason you don't murder is because God may. We never say it that way. But Deuteronomy 32:35, vengeance is mine and recompense for the time when their foot shall slip, for the day of their calamity is at hand and their doom comes swiftly. What does God say? You don't take vengeance because that belongs to God. Who does it belong to? It belongs to God. And so if he wants to dole out destruction, the exact reason why it would be wrong for you to do it is because it's his right to do it. So no, I can't hold God to the same moral standard of a human person or even a human society, because something is intrinsically different about that, as much as I struggle to deal with that myself. So I'd say God is not necessarily amenable to the moral laws applied to humanity, or they're not amenable to him. That'd be a better way to say it. And we are not obligated to assume everything God does is a good thing for a human to do. I know we say we need to imitate God. That's usually the case in terms of character. But there are some things God does because he's God that you don't get to do because he's God, right? I always said when I got to be a parent, I would never say the words because I said so. Then I had kids, and now I say all the time because I said so. That when I was a kid, that seemed so unfair. Of course, Dad and I should be on the same playing field of rules. And then you find out, actually, no, it can't be that way. Even when we're trying to be just and fair, being a father is different than being a child. Being a God is different than being a creature. And that just doesn't go away. The Bible does say that God is aware of this situation. And if I have some hope to give you, it might come from passages like Romans 8:19-22. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, and hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now. The whole created universe, the whole scope of human history, all of it has been subject to futility. We're supposed to be able to see these scenes and say, yeah, that is awful. It's not supposed to be good. It's awful. It's the consequence of sin in the world. It's terrible. And there's no nice way of dealing with that. The only solution is exactly the solution that God brought to bear. God fully acknowledges that human sin made an unspeakable mess. In the death of Jesus, God accepts those consequences himself on our behalf. So the very God to whom I've made the case doesn't have to answer for these crimes because they're not crimes for him. Instead, takes my place for the crimes I actually have committed, showing that he is not a cold and distant judge, and that everything that has happened was performed by the same person who was willing to die in my place. So I don't have great answers to all the stories of the book of Joshua. They're unpleasant, and there are several others in the Old Testament that I find unnerving. Now that I'm a father, I find them even more unnerving when they talk about kids. They just bug me. I do have to remember that God is different than me, that there are some things I don't know, and apparently he doesn't mind me asking, and so I do. And we study, and we think about it, and we talk, and remember at the end of the day, it's the same person who died on the cross. It wasn't a lack of compassion that led to the story of Joshua. It was something else. And I think we need to keep that in mind. Hope that helps you in some way. If you want to talk about it more, I'd be glad to chat with you. I don't know anything else, but I'll be happy to say all this over again.